What you see on the screen right now is a list recapping all the ReZero novels you would need to read if you wanted to get fully caught up with the series. Every item mentioned is a story that requires you to set aside some time on an afternoon to read it calmly. Now, I know what you're thinking. Even if there are a lot of novels on this list, it still doesn't hit the 1,000 chapters of One Piece, so there's no way the video title is true, right? Well, you're wrong. Does this list recap the novels? Yes, but it only recaps the side stories. Furthermore, this image you're looking at is outdated. It was made at the beginning of the pandemic. And in case you still think the pandemic was just a little while ago, it's actually been 6 years already. Believe me, the number of ReZero side stories has increased significantly since then. They've grown so much that they're almost at the 400 mark. Now, 400 is a much lower number than 1,000, the number of One Piece episodes. But hold on a second. So far, we've only talked about side stories. The term side story implies there is a main story, and that is exactly the case. As of today, while I'm writing this on March 30th, 2026, the main ReZero novel has 728 published chapters. So, if you want to read the entire ReZero universe, you'd have to read approximately 1,100 chapters. And while that might seem close to One Piece's manga numbers, you have to remember, reading a 30 to 40 page novel chapter of pure text is not the same as reading a 20-page manga episode with tons of art and very little text. Fact is, in the time it takes you to read one ReZero novel chapter, you could easily breeze through 3 or 4 episodes of the One Piece manga. In this video, I want to talk about the monstrous branching out that Teppei Nagatsuki, the author, has done with this great universe I love and hate called ReZero. I'll also tell you later exactly how long it took me to read all of this. But before we start, a quick shout out to the members of the channel's most expensive tier. A quick hello to Nacho Velasquez, who has been very active in my community lately, to Loco Felix, and to Trollmax. On the English side of my community, we don't have any new people, though I want to personally thank Isidora Dorada, who for some reason pays for a membership on both of my channels. Thanks for the double support. But now let's get into the video. Welcome to why reading ReZero is harder than catching up with One Piece. How and why do so many ReZero stories even exist? Let's just say Teppei really likes to write. While ReZero has been a relatively popular phenomenon for a few years now, the author has actually been writing the stories since 2012. Nowadays, we fans are lucky to get 13 novel chapters every 2 months. But in the beginning, the author was a writing machine. He updated his Japanese blog, Naru, almost daily. There were even days where he'd upload 2 chapters a day. He was moving at such a beastly pace that I remember reading posts from that era where he said he expected to finish the series by 2022. Well, here we are in 2026, and he's just now saying we've entered the final stretch. Honestly, his words give me the same vibes as when Oda said we were halfway through One Piece back in 2010. But back to the point. In 2012, Teppei wrote a ton of main novel chapters and even found the time to write side stories for his work back then. I know the fact that ReZero has side stories isn't surprising today, but guys, we're talking about 2012. Even then, the author was publishing side stories with no primary relation to the main canon just because he wanted to write about the characters' relationships when Subaru wasn't busy dying. And if you're wondering, the first side story ever published was the mayonnaise one. Thinking back, it's actually really nice that the first side story the anime adapted was also the mayonnaise story. However, something was about to happen. Soon, a Japanese novel publisher would contact him to publish his work in the light novel format. You see, until then, what the author uploaded to Naru was the unique and official version of the work, the version informally known as the web novel. But they couldn't just print that version as is for the retail market, and thus the light novel version of ReZero was born. What's the difference between the two? Almost nothing. The light novel largely follows the web novel version, but sometimes it has certain changes the author considers necessary for the pacing and plot. It's not that one version is superior to the other. They are just slightly different canons, but the general plot remains. But since I know you want an exact number on the similarity, I'd say they are about 98% the same. Why did I put you through a boring history lesson about the web novel and light novel? Well, because besides wanting to monetize the video length, it's also because it relates to the origin of the side stories. Believe it or not, they also have their web novel and light novel versions. Yes, exactly like the main novel, but I'll explain that now. And since I know all this has sounded confusing, here's a shitty meme to get your attention back. Summing it up, you just discovered the origin of the web novel and the light novel, and that the side stories also exist in both versions. Now, I think it's time to explain how there are so many of them. To boost light novel sales, side stories were created. If you buy a volume of the main novel, you have the chance to get one of the side stories that usually come with them. Usually, there are only about 3 extra stories per volume, and currently, we're only at 44 volumes of the light novel. But remember, at the start, I said there are approximately 400 side stories. That's weird, right? If there are only 44 volumes and 3 stories per volume, that only gives us about 130. So where the hell do the other 270 stories come from? Well, even I didn't quite understand it at first, but from what I've been able to dig up, it turns out that in Japan, there are certain stores or magazines that publish side stories every so often to expand the lore. This means that in a single month, not only do the side stories from the novel volumes come out, but if the stars align, new stories might be published elsewhere in Japan at the same time. Like I said, this doesn't happen every single month. But since the series started its light novel run in 2014, it's happened a lot. No, but here's where things get complicated. Remember how I told you that both the main novel and the side stories have 2 versions? Well, let's be clear. As much as I love the side stories, some aren't exactly vital to the plot. For example, narrating the lazy afternoon Petra had in episode 6 of the first season isn't the same as narrating what Echidna's life was like 400 years ago. In other words, some side stories are more important than others, and Kadokawa, the publisher that owns the rights to ReZero, knows this. But what nobody knows is exactly what criteria they use to compile certain stories that were distributed by magazines and stores to re-release them in a single volume collection. Kind of like I do with my shorts, bundling them into a single series. From this compilation process, the Tanpin Shu are born. These volumes collect a large portion of the stories that came out in a certain period and sell them to those who couldn't buy them at the time. But since it's all about the money, the author also writes new stories that are included for free if you buy these compilation volumes. Basically, Kadokawa bundles old stories to sell them to you as new, while simultaneously selling you brand new stories that, if they feel like it, they'll probably sell to you again in the next Tanpenshu collections. To be clear, that last part hasn't happened yet, but it would be pretty funny, wouldn't it? Anyway, you might think that if you've already read the side stories when they came out in their respective magazines, you don't need to read them again when they hit the Tanpenshu collection. You'd be wrong. It turns out that the stories published there are almost always rewritten or even have new sections added. So if you've read them before, screw you, you have to read them again. In fact, this happened to me with the stories about how the candidates' camps were formed. For example, the way Krush and Wilhelm met is different in the light novel and web novel versions. The same happens with Felt's stories. Personally, as contradictory as it sounds, I find these changes interesting. Knowing the author felt the need to rewrite certain parts usually means he plans to reference them in the future, so we have to stay sharp. For instance, when he rewrote the stories about how Felt's camp was formed, the author made sure to include a chapter about how the Council of Sages reacted, those guys the king delegated to run the nation in his absence. He wrote a chapter narrating how each one reacted to the possible return of an heir, and honestly, that was a great call. The web novel version, where the council showed zero interest in meeting the potential lost princess, felt really weird. Fortunately, this was fixed in the light novel. Personally, I think the rewriting isn't the only thing we should watch out for. We should also pay attention to which side stories get compiled and published here. Because as I said, they don't collect all of them, only some. I believe if a story ends up in a Tanpenshu, it's because it's a side story you must read. I feel validated in this when I see that the Tanpenshu always include the stories about Aldebaran's origins. So if you want to read the side stories but don't have time for all 400, you'll probably be fine just reading the ones recapped in the Tanpenshu. Before I change the subject, I realize I haven't mentioned the EX novels. I didn't cover them simply because those novels are very well known. They're stories anyone entering this fandom will discover instantly. The only thing I'll add is that buying the EX volumes also gets you more side stories that the author creates just to boost those sales. So, recapping. The side stories are massive in number because, besides coming with the purchase of every main volume and every EX volume, there are constantly magazines and stores publishing new editions on their own, written by the author, of course. Eventually, the publisher compiles them into the Tanpenshu format, which brings even more exclusive stories, and forming an endless cycle where the only way to satisfy your collector's itch is to never stop buying. The funniest part is that even with everything I just told you, I haven't covered all the side story distributions. Sometimes the author publishes stories on his own, like the time he released a 300-page novel about something that happened 300 years before episode 1. Or sometimes the author pulls these weird publicity stunts that increase the reading list, like the time he sold a printed story on a towel. Believe me, I wish I were joking, but there was a story involving Rem, Ram, and Echidna that you could only read if you bought the towel. The most hilarious part is that they didn't give you a book with the towel. The actual text of the story was printed directly onto the fabric of the towel itself. But let's talk about the elephant in the room. How long will it take to read all of ReZero? Before answering, we have to remember there are 2 types of people in this life. Those who are unemployed and read all of this because they have nothing else to do, and those who barely have any time because they're working. Personally, I've been both. I read the entire main novel during my work breaks, and I read the rest when I was unemployed. And by unemployed, I mean when I already had my YouTube channel. Doing the math and reading the main novel for an average of 1 to 2 hours a day, It took me about 2 to 3 months to get caught up with the main story, but, and this is important, that only took me up to Arc 6. I'm not including Arcs 7 and 8 because at that time, those arcs were just starting. I left the franchise for a few years. And when I became a YouTuber, I realized I'd have to read the rest of the main novel, but also all the side stories. So, when August 2024 rolled around, I decided to focus on reading everything I was missing from ReZero. That's when I started reading the roughly 200 chapters of Arcs 7 and 8 and all the side stories. I remember reading the Wallachia arc was actually pretty easy at first, but as it entered its climax, the experience became truly grueling. I remember a point where reading just one chapter took about an hour of uninterrupted focus. I'm being honest when I say the chapters in this part are dense, but they are worth it if you enjoy the plot. Just to show you what I mean, here's a recording of how long one episode lasts in this part. If I recall correctly, reading those 200 main novel chapters took me about 2 to 3 weeks, but that was at a pace where my entire day consisted of nothing but reading. And I wasn't reading it in my native language, but in English. Even though I'm fluent, my comprehension and speed aren't 100% compared to my mother tongue. At that time, I clearly remember there were only 300 side stories, so I read those in about a month. But keep in mind, those reading sessions were titanic, several hours a day. Keep this in mind if you have daily obligations, because the number of hours you can dedicate will vary. Remember that side stories aren't all the same length. Some are barely 10 pages, while others can be 300 or 400 pages long. In fact, just the 3 main Wilhelm novels can reach almost 700 to 900 pages total. And for some reason, Wilhelm's side stories also have their own side stories. Props to Tape for creating side stories for the side stories. Because of this variance in length, it took me longer to read the side stories than Arcs 7 and 8 combined. And those are the longest arcs in the entire series. So, in summary, even if you were unemployed and dedicated yourself 24/7 to reading ReZero, it will take you a minimum of 2 months to complete the journey of reading the entire main and side story. But if you contribute to your country's economy, meaning if you work, it's safe to say you'll have to multiply the months invested based on your own pace and reading time. I didn't mention it before, but the reason I did those 2 months of non-stop reading is because I was making an iceberg video of the whole series. I'll leave that as a recommended video if you want to see it, but if you're from my English channel, you'll have to wait. Anyway, that's all for now. See ya!